Okay, we've had a steady stream of folks jumping on, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. For those who just joined, my name is Isabel McLean. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Virginia Housing Alliance. Appreciate you coming here today for our Lunch and Learn, focusing on the 2025 General Assembly and giving a wrap up of all housing legislation that has passed and kind of where we are right now with our state budget. I've asked folks as they come in to introduce themselves in the chat, just so we know who all is here. And I encourage you to use the chat to ask questions throughout this presentation today. There will be time at the end for me to look through the chat and answer also any questions from you all if you want to hop off mute as well. This webinar today, it will be recorded. It's already recording. We will share that with folks who registered today, and it will also be shared on our website. So if you missed anything today, or you want some of the materials, the slides, or we also have a one-pager with some of this information, it will be available on our website and emailed to you for registering today. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So before I jump into more of the specifics of the what we have gotten out of this General Assembly, I want to level set for where we are within the timeline of the legislative process, so you understand what's still on the table and what has already been decided. So this year, 2025, was a short legislative session year, meaning that we only met for 45 days. And so the session ended on February 22nd. That was the last day for the General Assembly to, that they are communicating any bills that have passed out of both chambers and the General Assembly, and they've done their work and communicated that to the governor. March 24th this year was the deadline for the governor to take action on bills that were passed by the General Assembly and the budget proposal that they sent to him. He responded, and then there's a little bit of a delay, but then all the General Assembly comes back again for a reconvene session, and that occurred on April 2nd of last week. This is when they come back together to respond to the governor's actions. For example, if he amended a bill, they would decide whether to accept those amendments or reject them. If he vetoed a bill and there was a veto-proof majority, meaning that 2/3 of the General Assembly could vote to overturn it, that would be this reconvene session is that opportunity. And then also it is supposed to be the time too where they hopefully decide and pass a budget. Unfortunately, this year, the governor had quite a few recommendations for the budget that the General Assembly decided to reject. And so they were not able to come to an agreement and pass a budget on April 2nd. So as you can see on this timeline, there's a question mark. If they do come to an agreement and decide to pass a budget that the governor and the General Assembly could get behind, they will have to come back for a special session to pass that. Also, with the kind of changing housing landscape that we're in right now, there has been talk too of the potential of a special session to respond to different federal issues as well. So at any time, the governor can call that special session. So what I'm going to be talking about today is mainly the bills that have passed that the governor has either approved or amended and the General Assembly accepted that, and now those bills are on their way to becoming law. In Virginia, usually that means that those bills become official law on July 1st of that year, unless otherwise stated. Some bills have delayed enactment clauses and things like that, but most often they will become in effect on July 1st. I will also share today just an update about where we are in the budget process and what is still on the table to be negotiated. All righty. So while this legislative session was not as successful for housing policy as we had hoped, there are still significant victories. And most importantly, every year we're building more momentum and more support for affordable housing, spreading more information and more education about its importance. and trying to build, that public support and that momentum to be able to be more effective in the next year. Um, so I've kind of divided up these results or these products from the General Assembly into a couple different categories. But just keep in mind that there's not as many as you would hope. Many of you coming here today, may have heard about other bills or other things that were discussed during the General Assembly that I'm not going to be mentioning today because they were not successful. But I would be really happy to talk about them if you're curious about how far they made it and what happened. Again, you can put those questions in the chat or we can talk about that at the end. So don't be surprised that there's not a lot of housing related bills that made it out, but there were quite a few that were introduced and discussed. So we can touch on those later. All right, so the first category is related to property taxes. And this first bill on your screen here was one of Virginia Housing Alliance's top priorities. This was the second year that we worked on this bill, and it is one of our really big victories that we want to celebrate this year. Delegate Katrina Carlson, who represents areas in Charlottesville, introduced this bill, and she was a really amazing and effective patron. So I want to make sure I give her shout out here because this bill's success is definitely due in part to her efforts. So this bill is related to assessments of affordable housing. This may be familiar for those of you who have followed our agenda over the years, but specifically this is responding to problems that we've heard for many years now and from across Virginia that affordable housing is being assessed frequently as still market rate housing, that the limited income and the rent restrictions that come with affordable housing are not being considered fully for how that impacts the value of that property. And so as a result, affordable housing is often taxed higher than what should be, their fair tax burden. It can get a little bit complicated and detailed. I won't necessarily go into all of that, but specifically for affordable housing that the value is dependent on this limited income, it is generally accepted appraisal practices that you should use what's called the income approach to assess these properties. And our current code, has had language saying that the income approach, should be used. And there's, a lot of information out there in standard professional practices about how the income approach should be used, but it was worded strangely in our code that created some loopholes where it made it seem like it was optional. And so, I will say a lot of tax assessors were not doing this intentionally. Some of them weren't aware of this requirement or weren't aware the property is affordable, but there are also some cases of folks who were intentionally interpreting this code to be optional. And so what we were able to achieve this year with this bill is to clarify, to close that loophole and make it really clear that affordable housing must be assessed using that income approach if the income and expense data has been provided to the assessor, which in most situations, the vast majority of the affordable housing providers we've spoken to have provided that. But we also included a part of this in this bill where we're going to be working with stakeholders to create a standard form, a standard process for what that income and expense data reporting should look like, so everybody knows what to expect, and there's a very clear process here for how to do that. In addition, we're going to be working with the Department of Taxation to develop a training for assessors about the income approach and the new requirements under this code. As I mentioned earlier about how some bills have a delayed enactment clause, this bill does have a delayed enactment specifically for the requirement for income-based tax assessments for January 1st, 2026, mainly because there are pieces of it where we have to make that standard form, and we also have to develop that training. So the rest of this year will be spent doing that, and then officially on January 1st, the standard form, will be available, and this the bill in its entirety will go into effect. The next bill on here was introduced by Delegate Hernandez and Senator Rouse, and it's related specifically to property tax relief for elderly and disabled homeowners. So right now in Virginia, localities are given the authority uh, to offer property tax relief or exemptions for older adults and folks with disabilities. Um, and they can do so in different ways. Some of them choose to do that also based on income, et cetera. I'm sure many of you are from places that maybe have some version of this. Um, this bill was introduced to include a few fixes to that part of our code to make it really clear, basically to try to remove some barriers to it. So increasing the accessibility to the program and awareness of the program, making it really clear that even if you are behind on your taxes, you can still apply for this program and then be put on a payment plan, et cetera. So wanting to make sure that localities were aware of that, that they had that flexibility, and put in some requirements that localities communicate more about this program if they have it, so that more homeowners are aware of it. All right, we did have a couple bills related to tenant protections that passed this year. The first is a bill that was introduced by Delegate Adele McClure and Senator Adam Ebbin. This bill requires that landlords, specifically those that own 5 or more units, which this is a typical way for the legislature to differentiate between small landlords and large landlords. So there's often some carve-outs that they choose to do for, quote unquote, mom and pop landlords. So the legislature decided that they wanted this carve out specifically for this bill. So it does only apply to landlords owning 5 or more units, but they are now required to provide notice of non-renewal of a lease at least 60 days in advance. Previous bills in recent years have changed, basically have added to our landlord-tenant law that you have to provide 60 days notice for a rent increase. So that is already law, but this now aligns also 60-day notice for any sort of non-renewal of a lease as well. The next bill on here is related to payment methods for rent or security deposits and other housing costs between a tenant and a landlord. Delegate Tran and Senator Srinivasan introduced this. Specifically, in the form that passed the General Assembly and was approved by the governor, it prohibits landlords from charging fees for the collection of rent or security deposits. So, for example, if you're paying with a credit card and then there's a 2% fee or something, this is pretty common that landlords will pass that fee on to the tenant for using a credit card. Specifically, this bill says that you cannot do that unless you are offering an alternative payment method that doesn't have fees. So if you are able to also accept check or cash or money order, whatever other options, and you're offering credit card, a landlord can still charge a fee for paying via credit card. But if the only way to pay, which is we've seen this in many situations where there's online portals and the only way to pay is through a credit card, that there is or a credit card or a connecting to a bank account or things like that come with fees, that there's no option to pay without those fees. So this clarifies that, and just make sure that there is at least always a way to pay your rent and your security deposit without fees. The last bill on here is related also to fees, but specifically disclosure of them. So in our current landlord-tenant law, landlords are required to explicitly list out an itemization of all the charges that they will be giving to the tenant, what rent will be, any other, what the security deposit will be, any other fees or one-time costs as well. This bill, introduced by Delegate Simon, specifies that has to be listed on the first page of the lease to make it really clear to folks when they are entering into this agreement what is being required of them. We know that leases can be very, very long and use a lot of language that may not be as understandable or as clear to everyone. And so to ensure that those fees and those costs don't get lost somewhere within the lease, they will now be required to be listed on the first page. There was one bill this year related to eviction prevention, beyond tenant protections that passed. This bill was actually a recommendation of the Virginia Housing Commission. This it is expanding and continuing a pilot program that we've had for several years here in Virginia now called the Eviction Diversion Pilot Program. This is specifically um, giving general district courts the ability to have like a little bit more flexibility or set up this program where they can offer payment plans to tenants and help tenants and landlords come to that sort of agreement for a payment plan. It's really designed to, doesn't necessarily like, it's not designed to provide, emergency rental assistance for that tenant, but it's designed to be an extra step along the way, especially for folks who maybe this is the first time they've fallen behind on rent. They had a medical bill or, other sort of unexpected costs, and now suddenly they're behind. And this is a way to try to intervene there before that starts to accumulate and kind of avalanche into a bigger problem where there's more late fees and then continued. It can be much harder to catch up at that point. And this program provides kind of a payment plan and an option and provides some of that landlord-tenant mediation. Right now, it has been only used in 4 localities, I believe Danville, Hampton, Petersburg, and Richmond. And it's been successful. There's definitely been it's definitely been useful, but it has been on such a small scale and not been able to, be used by everyone going through eviction courts. This isn't the only tool that we should have in the repertoire to stop evictions, but it's one of them. And so the General Assembly decided that it no longer needs to be a pilot. It has demonstrated its worth. And so they've removed the sunset date that, kind of had an end time, an expiration for this program, and also expanded it, allowing all general district courts to take part of this program if they choose to do so. So that will now be permanent and something potentially available across Virginia. There are 2 other bills I want to talk about that are more generally related to affordable housing and don't quite fit into the other categories. Both were introduced by Delegate Betsy Carr, who is a housing champion. She does introduces usually a lot of bills related to housing. The first bill here may be familiar for some of you all if you'd paid attention to this bill, or it was also introduced last year. It's been kind of called the Faith in Housing Bill. Originally, the idea behind this was that the intent and what kind of brought people around this bill last year and this year is to try to remove barriers and facilitate the development of affordable housing on land that's owned by faith-based organizations. There's been, a lot of research and a lot of interest in trying to partner with faith-based organizations for affordable housing. The version of the bill this year that specifically passed out of the General Assembly included a little bit more than the bill that the governor actually approved. He offered some amendments to it. So I'll tell you what the actual bill does now, and then I can provide a little bit more context for some other things that were potentially on the table. But specifically what the version of the bill that the governor amended and the General Assembly accepted his amendments, and then it's approved and will become law. It only includes language that directs the Department of Housing and Community Development to put together to develop a list with stakeholders, with stakeholder engagement, develop a list of policy options and different kind of strategies that localities can use with their existing authority that they have now to stimulate the development of affordable housing. They've also used the term specifically property owned by property tax exempt nonprofits, not just only faith-based organizations, but of course, faith-based organizations are included under that. So that is what was actually passed. I will say that there were definitely different versions last year and earlier this year that either tried to go ahead and enact some of those policy options that I think might be on that list, or you know, change some potential, provide more opportunities for zoning or permitting, expedite or to expedite permitting, or remove zoning requirements specifically for these properties. There's also were conversations about creating funding to help subsidize this type of development, to provide technical assistance to such organizations that may not have a lot of knowledge and experience about affordable housing, but want to engage. Um, Also funding sources for pre-development costs, et cetera. There have been a lot of different conversations around this, so I did want to just acknowledge that you may be expecting a different version of this bill for what actually made it out, but there is continuing work around that and a lot of conversations about what that should look like in Virginia. But for now, what progress has been made is that, as I said, DHCD will be tasked to work with stakeholders to create that list of various options. The next bill on here is related to community land trusts. This is a bit of a technical bill and a technical fix, but something that is will be hopefully very helpful. It basically changes some of the language in our current code for how community land trusts are defined, and how they must be, like how they must operate in order to be considered. Um, Community land trusts, there's been some language in our current code that specifically says that a community land trust has to, or is a membership corporation. Again, I'm probably going into a little bit too much detail here, but they decided this bill will remove that language and make it more clear what a community land trust is, because many of the ones that we do have that are currently working in Virginia are not actually incorporated as a membership corporation. And so this was a way to ensure that our code matches how our community land trusts work in practice, and to ensure that this maybe potential discrepancy isn't used in some way to provide confusion, issues with with property taxes, et cetera, potential down the road. None of those problems have come up yet, that at least that I'm aware of, that this was more of a preemptive bill to avoid that and ensure that our code did align with what we have in practice. If you want more information about that, I can connect you with some of the folks that worked on that. Okay, so those are all of the key housing related bills that passed out of the General Assembly that have received governor approval. As I said, not a super long list, but those are the ones that we do know for sure will be coming law this year. Now, where are we with the state budget? As I said earlier, we don't have a finalized state budget, but I will say, so the way that Virginia works with our budget process, it's on a 2-year cycle, a biennium budget. And last year was our budget year, where they had to pass the FY25 and FY26 budget for these 2 years. This year is not a budget year, but every year you do have the opportunity to edit the budget that was passed last year and add changes to it and pass a new version of that. So I say that because technically we already do have a budget for FY26 moving forward, and if it really comes down to it, we don't absolutely need to have an updated budget. But I will say more often than not, this is an opportunity to make adjustments that are necessary. In particular, there was quite a large surplus from FY25 funding that was on the table this year. So I think there's a lot of interest and momentum behind passing a budget this year to be able to allocate that surplus into some much needed programs, et cetera, specifically if they're new or one-time programs. So again, we don't know for sure what that will look like, but I do think it does seem like, it seems likely that they will eventually come to something of an agreement, but there are quite a few differences between what the governor has recommended to be in the budget and what the General Assembly would like. So quite a lot of differences to resolve there. Um, because they were working with a lot of the surplus this year, I will say that a lot of the things that they considered that they actually funded were they prioritized things that were one-time sources of funding. So as you'll see here on this chart, and I'll go through each item line, but you'll see when I've mentioned that something is a one-time allocation or one-time funding for programs, that would be like a pilot program or um, to support a specific project, things like that. That was more likely to get funding because of that surplus. They do not often, they do it sometimes, they're definitely allowed to, but I will say it is often there's some hesitation in an off-budget year to greatly increase programs that would then be continued funding down the road. That some of those decisions are more likely to be made in an actual budget year. So there's the context about where we are right now with the budget. The things here in this chart that you'll see, these are the budget items that are either still on the table or something that people are still talking about because the governor vetoed. So I did want to include that on there, but technically the thing that he vetoed is no longer on the table. The rest of the stuff on here are things that were included in the General Assembly budget that the governor responded to. Either he recommended they eliminate that funding, either he didn't have a recommendation for it, so that funding would be sustained. He didn't recommend any changes to it, or he reduced the funding or potentially amended language around where that funding was going. He can veto line items in the bill, in the budget, I mean. And so he did use that authority specifically here to veto the funding for 2 pilot programs. It's a bit interesting because these programs were funded, were approved by the governor and the General Assembly in the budget passed last year for fiscal year 2025. It's $5 million each to set up a pilot program that provides low-income home buyer assistance and a program that helps nonprofits or residents acquire manufactured home parks. So again, both of these were one-time pilot programs for $5 million each, and they were passed last year. We throughout fiscal year 2025, before this General Assembly, we didn't see any movement on these programs being started, which was frustrating. And so when we actually came back for this General Assembly and the governor, he starts the budget process by offering his own kind of budget amendments to get things going. He did amend out these programs. And so it started to make a little bit more sense of, maybe he didn't want these programs to get started, wanted to remove that funding. The General Assembly decided to put that funding back in, as was, approved by everyone last year, put it back in, not to remove it. But unfortunately, when it did get to the governor in this last stage, he did veto those programs. So I mention this because the Speaker of the House, Speaker Don Scott, did mention on the floor, specifically highlight these programs that they were vetoed, and did call out the governor, saying that was, I can't remember exactly what word he used, but he was very frustrated that this happened. And so this has been one way that housing has kind of gotten in some headlines and gotten some attention here. So we'll see what next steps are for that. But because he vetoed them, they are no longer on the table. The first item on here that has not been vetoed is a budget amendment that would establish a rental assistance pilot program funded with state funds. And this is you probably, if you follow Virginia Housing Alliance, you will have heard about this. This is one of our top priorities that we've been managing a public campaign around with many housing and education advocates, our 5,000 Families program, which would provide rental assistance to low-income families with school-aged children, really highlighting the importance of housing stability and education, and trying to create new pathways for families or new and additional pathways for families to get housing assistance. This, in the General Assembly budget, They included $20 million for it, which was really exciting. This was our second year on this campaign, and we made significant progress this General Assembly and built quite a lot of support and momentum around it. We had bipartisan patrons from all different regions throughout Virginia that were championing this program. We had Senator Locke, who represents areas in Hampton Roads, is a Democrat and also is a leader in the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, as well as a budget conferee, so carries quite a lot of power when it comes to the budget, as well as Senator Pillion, who represents areas in Southwest Virginia, and he is also on the Senate Finance Committee and is also often a budget conferee. So both of them, or he's also a Republican. So both of them, pretty powerful folks in the Senate, across the aisle and across different regions. And then in the House, we had Delegate Breonna Sewell, who's a Democrat from areas in Northern Virginia, and Delegate Carrie Coyner, who's a Republican representing areas here in Central Virginia, and who is also, they're both very passionate about housing and education, have done quite a lot of work to ensure that this got included in the General Assembly budget. So to say that we got that support, we got some funding in there, was a huge victory. Unfortunately, the governor did make it clear throughout the process, throughout the session, that he did not support this program. We did introduce this as a bill and a budget item. Usually when, or often I will say, when you introduce a bill that is mainly trying to set up a program with funding, and it could be just enacted through the budget, often the bill will technically die, but they'll just incorporate it into the final budget. We wanted to have it be a bill too because it does provide more opportunities for folks to hear about this program. It goes to a different committee. There's an opportunity for community testimony, et cetera. So it did get more exposure for the program. Because it did offer an opportunity for public testimony, we learned when the governor had Brian Horn, who's the director of DHCD, come and express opposition to the bill. So because we learned that, and we were a little concerned that the governor would not want that to stay in the final budget, and we were not surprised. He did recommend that funding be eliminated, all $20 million of it. However, when the General Assembly reconvened last week, they did reject that amendment or that recommendation. So it's technically still on the table, and we'll see where it goes from here. The last thing I'll say about that is that in the final version of what was passed in the General Assembly budget, it did end up limiting the pilot program to just 2 regions, which was not our original intent. We wanted this to lay the foundation for a statewide program. But through the process, it ended up being limited just to Planning District 8 and Planning District 23. I believe that's the number for the Hampton Roads area. Those are still areas where many, many people would benefit from this program. But we are thinking, we'll see what happens. I don't know if that'll be if it is funded and if it will stay in that form itself. There's been a lot of discussions about that. The next item on here is funding that we have set aside specifically for our continuum of care agencies, those who provide the leadership role and coordination and collaboration among homeless service providers throughout Virginia. A lot of the funding that they do receive from both the federal and the state levels has specific thresholds for how much of that funding can be used for capacity building or administrative needs. And we have seen for the past several years and for a while a very serious growing need for more of that flexible funding to support their growth, to support their administrative needs, and ensure that they are still growing in capacity and in a sustainable manner. We had requested for more funding of this, but ended up not necessarily increasing this, but actually reallocating funding that was, I don't want to say misallocated, but it was mistakenly just put in with general state funding for homeless services last year. I think there was miscommunication about the intent for that. And And so this year, they took that increased funding, which was $675,000 that we got last year, and set it aside as was our original intent, ensured that that was not just lumped into other funding that then would still be subject to those thresholds, but that it was set aside specifically for our intent of administrative and capacity building needs. The next item on here is related to our Housing Opportunity Tax Credit, which is our Virginia state tax credit, similar to the federal low-income housing tax credit program. This year, they had to pass language to extend the credit. In Virginia, all tax credits have a 5-year sunset period, basically meaning they expire every 5 years, so they need to be extended beyond that if we're continuing them. So the budget did include language to extend it, and it also included some language to add $4 million to the annual allocation each year for this. Right now it's at 60 million a year, so now it would be at 64 million. The governor did not change anything with that, and so it does seem likely that that will be included in the final budget, but again, we don't know for sure. Then I'll skip to the next thing on here. The General Assembly did include funding in their budget to establish a new grant program, grants for localities to establish local housing trust funds. Trying to provide that seed money to help encourage them and incentivize them to start building their own local housing trust funds. They had it funded at 13 million with some specific carve-outs for, they mentioned the city of Emporia, Prince William County, and Tazewell County to specifically get some of that funding, but the rest was open for other localities to apply for. The governor did recommend that get cut in half, so it should just be $6.5 million a year, but he didn't fully eliminate that, so we will see where that goes. The next item, it was a big priority of the Democratic Party this year, and it was to create a first-time home buyer grant program, is what it kind of ended up being in its final version. They provided $15 million for this up front. It would be a specific grant process for homeowners who make up to 100% of the, or wait, I think it's up to $100,000 a year. I may not be remembering all the details on that, but they would be able to qualify for a grant if they are purchasing a home. The governor recommended that be eliminated, so not entirely sure where that stands. If you want more detail about it, I can provide that more for you. I just need to refresh myself on those details. The next item here, or next two items, were some specific carving fund outs for a specific project, specifically an emergency shelter to be developed in Charlottesville, and $1.5 million to support that, and then another funding specifically to support the eviction prevention work that the organization For Kids does in the Hampton Roads area, and to help them kind of expand into other areas and do more work. I mean, there's significant need for more eviction prevention funding, and they do some really great work. So this budget would have included 1.5 million, or includes 1.5 million for them. The governor did not touch the 1.5 million for the eviction prevention money, but he did recommend cutting in half the amount of funding towards the emergency shelter in Charlotte. And then the last two things on here, the second one is just a language only amendment that was included in the budget. This was one of VHA's top priorities that we've been working on for a couple years now. There is a specific pool of money that is managed by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. It's called the, I think it's called Behavioral Health and Developmental Services Trust Fund that was created to provide some funding for the department to obtain housing or develop community-based housing specifically for Virginians with intellectual disabilities, and the language specifically says those leaving training centers. So this was, established shortly after, the settlement, DOJ settlement agreement, with a lot of different efforts to try to move away from over-institutional housing for people with disabilities and move away from this training center model. Now that we have far fewer training centers and have more community housing opportunities that also are more expansive, there's been interest in changing the language related to this trust fund to ensure it can be used for more folks with disabilities, not just those with intellectual disabilities leaving training centers, but those with other forms of disabilities and not necessarily tied to training centers. So we were successful in getting this language that expands that eligibility in the budget, and the governor did not recommend any changes to that. The last thing on here is a program that the governor proposed and worked on. He kind of created and they've been working on trying to figure out what this would look like throughout the General Assembly, but to establish a disaster and risk mitigation program managed by DHCD, specifically for qualified communities. They name those who had serious property damage as a result of wow, I'm forgetting the hurricane. Last year, Hurricane Helene? Yes. Okay. I don't know why I'm forgetting the name. And some other situations where there were emergency disaster issues. There was some amended language that the governor added to add a little bit more flexibility to cover disaster from more recent storms, including certain funding or flooding, that happened in February of this year. He also omitted some changes too to just add different criteria for it. But in general, it is a $50 million fund, 25 million of which goes more towards risk mitigation, and the other 25 million towards risk assistance after a disaster has occurred. And the governor has left that at 50 million, just made a few changes to it. So there's a lot of different details for that and what that program will look like. DHCD will be developing that if this budget is passed with that in that. So stay tuned, but it does seem like that is something that the General Assembly and the governor can agree on. Alrighty, I have been talking a lot, so I'm going to go more quickly through this. I wanted to just mention a couple of things that were on VHA's agenda that were not successful this year. I won't go into a ton of details, but I'll just highlight we did work on 2 bills that were vetoed. The first of which was our bill related to affordable housing preservation that we have worked on now 2 years with Delegate Bennett Parker. It would grant localities the authority to establish a right of first refusal during the sale of publicly assisted, subsidized affordable housing that is at risk of expiring affordability. We worked a lot on this bill and improved some of the language to it and got more. I say the bill this year is improved upon the one last year. Unfortunately, the governor still vetoed it again, but I do believe we made some progress on that. The next bill that was vetoed was almost exactly, I think it was pretty much exactly the same as the bill that passed last year that was also vetoed, introduced by Senator McPike, related to our inclusionary zoning ordinances or our affordable dwelling unit ordinances, what localities are allowed to do with regarding to having an inclusionary program that either incentivizes or mandates affordable units included in new development, in exchange for different kind of bonuses or reductions to fees, et cetera, that try to offset the cost of including those affordable units. Our current code only allows a handful of localities the full flexibility to do that as they choose. And many other localities have wanted that same flexibility so that they can make these programs more effective. Senator McPike's bill would have allowed all localities to have that flexibility. Unfortunately, it was vetoed again. Other things on here, Delegate Carr's been working on trying to establish a incentive fund for localities that would, incentivize any policies or ordinances that they pass that encourage more affordable and diverse housing, but it was not funded this year or passed. We also were trying to get more funding for our Housing State Trust Fund, but we're not successful. It will continue to be funded at 87.5 million. We also tried to get increase across the board for homeless services. But as I said earlier, we were only able to just ensure that that increase we got last year was used as intended. And then we also were advocating for increased funding to the State Rental Assistance Program, or SRAP, that's administered by DBHDS, providing rental assistance to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in the community, allowing them to be able to live on their own. It has been the increases to that funding source have not kept up with recent costs of living. And so we've actually lost some of the number of vouchers funded through this program. And so we've been trying to get to increase it to make up for that and to still expand the program, but we were not successful. If you want more information about other bills or want to get more detail for anything that I mentioned, we have a legislative tracker on our website at vahousingalliance.org that has all these bills and more, anything that was related to housing that we were tracking during the General Assembly, and you can click on them and get more information. And then, as I said earlier, we are going to be producing and putting on our website a one-pager with a lot of the information that I went over today that will be accessible on our website and to those who registered, as well as the slides from this presentation and the recording. All right, that is all. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up the floor for any questions. If there are other bills that you'd heard about that were introduced this year that were maybe on the table, but you didn't hear me mention today, or if you're curious about certain programs or initiatives and where they ended up, the floor is yours. I'll look through the chat to see if anybody asked any questions in the meantime. Thank you all for introducing yourself. I always appreciate being able to see who all is here. I don't think I see any questions.
So
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry, I
ahead.
have a quick question. I'm sorry, I don't know if it has anything to do with this, or maybe if you could answer this for me. So I'm Ms. Jennifer Tanner. I work with the Improvement Association here in Emporia, Virginia, and I'm the coordinator for housing. I do know that I think his name is Ronnie Franklin. He is with SCDHC, and they were working on a project for subsidized housing here in Emporia. I did hear you say that about the first time home buyer grant program that the General Assembly was requesting funds for, and the governor eliminated. I'm not for sure if you know about that, but I was just wondering if that could have been the reason why that they haven't started on the project. I know it was being talked about in 2023, but nothing has been done quite yet.
I'm not entirely sure I have all or I have details or know what program you're talking about, but I would love to look into that. If you want, I can put my email in the chat and we can touch base after this, so I can learn a little bit more about what program you'd heard the city of Emporia, trying to start but hasn't quite started yet. Is it specifically home ownership assistance?
Um, yes.
Okay.
Well, I do know it has something to do with subsidized housing.
Okay. Um, I will say the only thing that comes to mind is that I know that the city of Emporia has been wanting to start a local housing trust fund or expand what they currently have. I don't think that they do have one yet. And so there was advocacy from the city of Emporia that was kind of reflected in the funding that the General Assembly set aside for starter funds for local housing trust funds. And they were specifically named to get a portion of that. When the governor cut it in half, I think that the portion that they were set aside to get also cut in half, or at least with his recommendations, but they were still mentioned. So I am curious. I don't know exactly who from the city of Emporia was advocating for that, or if that's related to the program that you mentioned, but it could be that they we're looking for more funding to get something like that started. But I'll look into it and I'll put my email in the chat if
Thank
you
you
want to
so
touch
much. I
base
appreciate
on that.
it.
Yeah.
Isabel, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
So one of the budget items, the first time home buyer one for 15, I think it was 15 million.
Hmm.
You said something about that the Democrats wanted that. Uh, it's the program that will enable people who are make 100% of the area median income to be eligible to get down payment assistance and whatever. I thought that one was something that the governor initially wanted, and it was in the initial budget that he proposed. Because I could be wrong, that's what I
Yeah.
had heard.
Um, as far as I am aware, the governor did not include a first-time homebuyer grant in his recommendations for the budget that started. I know
Okay,
his main things were the disaster and mitigation
okay,
fund, and I know there had been a lot of conversation about his work to establish a workforce housing program through Virginia
right.
Housing. So those are the main things that dominated the conversation around the governor when he introduced the budget. This came from Delegate Cole. And as what I had heard from behind the scenes is that the Democratic Party publicly um, got on board and said that this was one of their top priorities.
Okay,
Um, so
okay, thank you.
I don't think it had the governor's support because he did also recommend to eliminate it. But I will say I just looked up the more details because I couldn't remember, but basically the grants were to be given to not to exceed $10,000 on a first come, first served basis to folks who were first time home buyers to cover those expenses incurred during that. And an eligible person would be someone who makes up to $100,000 a year or up to 100% of the area median income, as you said. So
Okay.
that was most of the details for that. But we'll see what happens. Again, the General Assembly did reject the governor's recommendations on that, so it's still technically on the table. Someone else have
And
another question? I saw a
I have a,
hand.
I'm sorry, I don't know where my hand thing is. I'm looking for it,
You're
so I
fine,
don't
no
mean to
worries.
cut in on you. I had a question about the bill HB 2218 with the fees for certain rent payment methods.
Mhm.
Does that include late fees, or is that just an extra fee that some landlords are charging when you use a check or a credit card?
Does not cover late fees. It's purely just fees that are charged based on the method that you're using. So yeah, if it's a credit card or a check specifically, or, whatever we have seen that um, is pretty common, but wanting to ensure that there is still a free option, a free payment method. But it doesn't change how much you're actually paying for the rent, or if
Right,
you
right,
don't
right.
pay it, getting a late fee. Yeah.
Definitely. And then my last question is the eviction prevention HB 1623, the expand eviction diversion pilot program. For that, is that just for medical fees? Like if you've been paying medical and you've got behind and that's why, is it just for medical? Could it be like income? Could it be like a loss to the household or
Yeah, so usually how that program has worked in the four localities that have that working with their general district courts is it's not there's no specific requirement for what costs got you behind on rent or where you are. It is just created in mind in the sense that it does not provide funding to help catch you up. And that's really only effective for folks who could catch up with a payment plan. So it's just trying to set up and say, if you could get caught up with a payment plan, if that's possible, and there just needs to be a little bit of that mediation to set that up, that's what this program kind of enabled and gave general district courts the kind of the support and structure to do that. Um, so it doesn't necessarily matter why you got behind. It's more just about like if a payment plan would be helpful and you could catch up, that might be an option for you. I saw in the chat that someone asked, how do we get our district courts to participate in that? I don't know exactly the process for that, but I can get that information for you, and I can talk to some of the folks who've worked at kind of worked with this program, particularly Virginia Poverty Law Center would probably have more information on that too. But if you put your email in the chat, or I can put mine in the chat, feel free to reach out to me and I can try to get that information to you. I also saw someone ask about the 14-day pay or quit period, but Caroline, I feel like you've had your hand up, so let me go to you first.
Oh, this is just quick. I wanted to say I'll put my email in the chat. For any questions for Southside about Emporia projects, you're welcome to reach out to me. I work with Robbie, and yeah, we're happy to chat.
Great. Well, then there you go. There's someone right here who could answer your question.
Thank you.
Um, so really quick, the question about the 14-day pay or quit period. So there have been efforts over the past several years to change from what we currently have, which is the 5-day pay or quit period, where if you don't pay your rent by the 5th day, that is when a landlord can file an eviction, or 5 days after your rent was due. During COVID, that was extended to 14 days, that they couldn't file an eviction until 14 days after. But that was taken back after COVID, and so there have been a lot of efforts to move back to that. Someone was asking, do people have people negotiated that number? I know there have been conversations over the past years about that, but I do think that the patrons and a lot of the folks working on this have remained pretty adamant that 14 days is what they want. But I am not entirely sure what all of those conversations have been, or if there is even room to negotiate, because it does seem that the opposition to it, and the governor, he vetoed those bills, unfortunately, so that's why I didn't talk about them today, has been really opposition to any increase of that. It doesn't seem to be that there is appetite for that negotiation, and that the Democrats, who have the majority in the House and the Senate, have passed it as 14 days. But we will see. We will have a different governor next year, and so I'm not entirely sure what those conversations are like. Someone, Virginia Sweet, go ahead and ask your question.
I think you pretty much covered it in the last question on House Bill 1719. I really don't understand the landlord's argument for what difference it would really make between 5 and 14 days. Do you have any insight into why that's opposed?
Yes, you can also, I will say if you are interested, I can send you the link to the recordings of the hearings related to those bills, and you'll hear the opposition and what sort of messaging they have against it. A lot of them, I think the common thread is if we're delaying the eviction process further, which they do not want to happen, have more delays to an eviction process for them, delaying when they could get the money or have the unit open for another person to come in and pay. And they've also used messaging, which has said that, delaying the process also hurts the tenant too, because then they will owe more, which I think is a little bit more of a questionable argument. But then they've also cited, that we do have the right of redemption currently in our code, which basically says that up until the day, 24 hours before the sheriff shows up to evict you, you can pay all that you owe and stop that eviction. And so they say that that's still giving you enough time. But we all know that when you file an eviction, you actually go to court. There are fees then and higher costs to that. And if we can postpone that and resolve the problem before it gets to that point, that does save money.
Great. Thank you. I understand much better.
Of course. Someone asked about if there are other advocacy opportunities going on. I realize we're also after one, so people need to go. That's totally all right, but I'll stay on for a little longer. There's definitely still an opportunity to communicate to your legislators and to the governor any of the budget items that are still being negotiated right now. We've sent out a big call to action that's sent many, many emails to the governor before he responded with his recommendations on the budget in particular, but really urging his support for it and wanting him to see how much there is support for it if he did decide to eliminate the funding. Unfortunately, he still did recommend that, but that call to action is still active, and I can share that in the link in the chat. And the more that we tell him how important it is hopefully the more he'll be willing to budge on that in these negotiations. But I will say that the budget process is not very transparent. It is a lot of these discussions happen behind closed doors, so it's really hard to know what's going to happen. And when we do get the public budget, can be a lot of surprises. And so I don't really know what's on the table and what potentially, could be negotiated to get this in. I will say that because the $20 million has been limited to just Planning District 8 and Planning District 23, those are Democrat districts. That's Delegate Sewell and Senator Locke's districts. That fits in with, I think the Democrats really wanted that, but since that doesn't include other districts or those that were from our Republican patrons for it, I do think that also made it a little bit more political. That potentially, I mean, I don't know, this was just a guess. I wasn't there for those conversations, but that may also be a reason why it has been kind of stalled right now. But all that aside, I'll put the call to action link in the chat. This goes to the governor. And of course, any communication that you do to your legislator, specifically if your legislator is on any of the finance committees in the Senate or the House, that can go somewhere towards communicating, hey, we really want you all to fight for this. There are specifically only a handful of legislators that are the budget conferees who have most of that power. And Senator Locke is one of them, and same with Senator Pillion. So I know that they're fighting for it, but the more of those conferees that we can get their support, the better. So I will grab that really quickly. If anyone else has a question, wants to hop off mute, you are welcome.
Okay, so I have one more question. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. So with the 14 days, I know that I have a program that deals with 14 days when it comes to evictions. Now, as far as the pay or quit, is that 5 days or is that 14 days?
So for pay or quit, right now under current code, it is 5 days. So say your rent's due on the 1st, if you haven't paid it by the 5th, the landlord can, after that 5th day, file an eviction. They can't do it sooner than that 5 days. What this bill would have done was try to say you can't start filing it until 14 days after rent was due to allow people to have, an opportunity to get another paycheck, etc. So does that answer your question?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I saw someone had asked, and I don't know if they're still here, what other cities were mentioned in the Housing Trust Fund grants. That funding was open. Most of it was open to any localities, but they did specifically have set asides for City of Emporia, Prince William, and Tazewell. So those are the 3 that were mentioned. I don't know if the person who asked that question is still here, but yeah. All right, so I did put in the chat the link to our call to action that communicates the legislator to the governor, how important 5,000 families is. If any of the other budget items are something that you want to advocate for, communicate that to the governor or to your legislator specifically, especially if they're on Senate or House Finance, and absolutely especially if they are a conferee, which I can let you know that list. It's a handful, not that many, but it is, hold on, only 11 legislators. In the House, it's Delegate Austin, Delegate Bloxham, Delegate Bulova, Delegate Carr, and then Senator Deeds, Senator Locke, Senator Lucas, Senator McDougal, Senator Pillion, and then also Delegate Sickles, and Delegate Torian. I kind of went all over the place there, but I can put those names in the chat. But if any of those are your legislature, those are the ones that are have most of the power right now in the negotiations with the governor. Any other questions? I think that I don't see if I see any more in the chat. So if you do have anything more, you can email me. I put my email in the chat. It's also was in the slides. you'll be getting information after this with the slides and the recording and the one pager that will all have my email on it too. So feel free to reach out if there's anything you think of later and want to ask me. Thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.